Girls, you won't believe what I discovered about my neighbor. I'm Ruth, and here on this channel, every week I bring you the most surprising gossip I see through my curtains. And this story I'm going to tell you today will leave you speechless, because what I thought was happening was one thing, but the reality, oh my God, the reality is completely different. It all started about 4 weeks ago, on a Monday morning that seemed like any other. I was in the kitchen, as I always do, watering my plants in the window and taking a quick peek at the neighborhood scene. You know how it is, right? We're not gossipers, we're just observant. And it was during this morning observation that I noticed a very strange movement at Carlos's house, my neighbor to the left. Carlos has always been a very reserved man, very much kept to himself. Married to Maria for over 15 years. He's the father of 2 teenage children, Miguel, 17, and Sofia, 15. A family that seemingly led a very proper, traditional life, you know. He's always been one of those polite neighbors who greets you when you pass them on the street, but never actually engages in a deeper conversation. A few months ago, he started working from home more. Maria always leaves early to work at a clothing store downtown. She's the manager there, and she's very dedicated to her work. Her children attend a full-time private school a little far from here, so they leave home at 6:30 in the morning and don't return until 5 in the afternoon. This means that during the entire workday, from 7 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, the house is entirely for Carlos. And it was precisely during this period that I began to notice the mysterious visits. Girls, you need to understand that I've lived here for over 20 years, and I know the neighborhood routine like the back of my hand. I know what time everyone leaves, what time they return, which cars pass by on the street, who visits whom. That's how we know when something unusual is happening, right? And what I began to notice at Carlos's house left me completely intrigued, and I confess, a little worried too. Every Monday, around 9:30 in the morning, always after Maria left for work and the children were already at school, a different woman would arrive at his house. And it wasn't just once in a while, no. It was religiously, every single weekday of the week. The first one I saw was a tall, elegant brunette with long straight hair that reached almost to her waist. She must have been around 35, maybe 40, well-groomed, with the demeanor of someone who cares about her appearance. She always arrived by car, a popular but well-maintained silver model. She wore eye-catching clothes, tight blouses, figure-hugging pants, high heels, and always impeccable makeup. And she carried a large brown leather bag, the kind that holds a lot of stuff. What intrigued me most was that she stayed inside the house for exactly 2 hours. I timed it several times. She arrived at 9:30 and left at 11:30, right on the dot. And when she left, she always looked a little tired, you know? Like she'd exerted herself physically. Sometimes she'd run her hand through her hair as if getting ready. Other times she'd look like she was checking her makeup in the rearview mirror before leaving. On Tuesday, it was a completely different blonde's turn. Shorter, maybe 45, with a very modern short haircut. One of those casual cuts that are in fashion these days. She always arrived by bus. I'd see her getting off at the bus stop on the corner and walking to Carlos's house with a large backpack on her back. One of those hiking backpacks, black with colorful details. Her look was more casual. Comfortable sneakers, jeans, and a simple blouse, but always very clean and tidy. She also had the same pattern, exactly 2 hours inside the house. And when she did go out, she also showed signs of fatigue. Sometimes she'd stop on the sidewalk to drink water from a bottle she'd taken from her backpack, as if needing to hydrate after some intense activity. Guys, please don't just like the video. Subscribe to the channel too, and leave a comment telling me if you've ever experienced a similar situation in your neighborhood. Have you ever imagined finding out something like this about a neighbor you thought you knew? And please don't leave the video now, because the ending of this story is absolutely surprising. You'll be shocked by what I really discovered. Wednesday featured a completely different character from the other two. A redhead with curly hair, always very well dressed, with that executive, professional air. She must have been around 50, wore a suit or formal outfit, high heels, impeccable makeup, and always carried a black leather briefcase, the kind lawyers and executives carry. This one arrived by car too, a slightly better model than the brunettes from Monday. And she had an interesting peculiarity. Before entering the house, she always glanced around as if checking if anyone was watching. It was a discreet movement, but one I always noticed from my window. The pattern remained the same, exactly 2 hours, and when he left, he always looked like he'd been working. Sometimes he'd fix his hair. Sometimes he'd check his phone as if checking to see if he'd missed any important messages during his time there. Thursday was the turn of a darker-skinned brunette, her hair always tied back in a neat, professional bun. She had a more serious, focused air. She wore conservative clothing, long-sleeved blouses, knee-length skirts, and low-heeled, closed-toe shoes. She always arrived by taxi, which was already eye-catching, because it's not every day you see a taxi stopping on our street. She also carried a large bag, but different from the others. It was more structured, square, as if she carried heavy things or equipment, and she behaved in the same way as the others. Exactly 2 hours, leaving with signs of fatigue, and a quick check of her appearance before leaving. And finally, on Friday, closing out the week, a gray-haired, more mature lady arrived, whom I estimated to be in her early 60s. This one was different from all the others. She arrived in a more luxurious car, much more expensive than the others, always impeccably dressed, with that air of someone with class and refined upbringing. But what intrigued me most about this lady was that she always carried bags, as if she were making some special delivery. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 paper bags, sometimes a small purse in addition to her usual bag. And when she left, unlike the others, she always seemed more cheerful, more smiley, as if she had just had a pleasant experience. Girls, I swear to you, at first I didn't know what to think. 5 different women, one for each day of the week, all very well groomed, all at the same time, always when Maria wasn't home. And Carlos greeted them all at the door with a smile, as if they were long-awaited and very welcome guests. My mind started racing, you can imagine. Could Carlos have been having 5 different affairs? Had he become one of those men who take advantage of their wives' work to do these indecent things? Poor Maria, working hard at the store, trusting her husband, without imagining what could be happening right under her nose. And the worst part, how did he manage to maintain 5 parallel relationships without any of the women knowing about the others? Was he a skilled manipulator? A professional liar? How could Maria have been so oblivious? You know I'm not one to meddle in other people's affairs, but this situation was bothering me deeply. Maria was always a dear neighbor, always very polite, always helpful. When I had to travel to care for my sick mother, she offered to water my plants. When I needed sugar or an ingredient that I'd run out of, she always helped without hesitation. How could I just pretend I didn't see anything? But at the same time, I couldn't just go up to her and say, "Look, Maria, your husband is seeing a different woman every day of the week when you're not home." Imagine the damage that could cause if I was wrong. What if there was an innocent explanation for all of this? So I decided I needed to investigate further before taking any action. I started writing everything down in a notebook. The exact times, the days of the week, how each of them arrived, how each of them dressed, what kind of car they used, how they left. I even made a detailed schedule with a description of each of them. During the second week of observation, I noticed that the pattern repeated itself with almost military precision. Monday, tall brunette with long hair, silver car, brown leather bag. Tuesday, short blonde with short hair, bus, hiking backpack. Wednesday, redhead with curly hair, better car, executive briefcase. Thursday, brunette with bun, taxi, structured bag. Friday, gray-haired lady, luxury car, mysterious bags, always at the same times, always for the same amount of time, always with the same dynamic. And what caught my attention most was that they never met. It was as if there was a very well-organized schedule so that one never bumped into the other. Quite suspicious, don't you think? It was in the third week that I began to notice some details that didn't quite fit with my initial theory. For example, if Carlos were having extramarital affairs, why didn't he seem the least bit concerned about being discreet? He greeted women at the front door, in broad daylight, and greeted them normally, as if he had nothing to hide. And even stranger, sometimes I'd see him at the living room window during his visits, and he didn't seem to be intimate with anyone. He seemed more like he was working, talking. It was hard to tell from a distance, but his body language didn't indicate he was having a secret romantic rendezvous. One morning I was sweeping the front sidewalk. Actually, I was doing it on purpose, so I'd have an excuse to be there when one of them arrived. And that's when Wednesday's redhead showed up. She politely greeted me with a friendly, "Good morning," and I, pretending to be oblivious, struck up a conversation. "Good morning. Are you new in the neighborhood?" I asked with the most innocent smile I could muster. She smiled back, but seemed a little surprised by the question. "No, I don't live here. I'm just coming to work." Work? She said work. Imagine what went through my mind at that moment. What kind of work would a woman do in a married man's house? Always at the same time? Always when his wife wasn't there? "Oh, that's interesting," I continued, trying to extract more information. "And what kind of work do you do?" She hesitated a moment before answering, as if considering how to explain. "It's something in the artistic field. It's a special project we're developing." Artistic area! Special project! Girls, my imagination ran wild. What kind of artistic project required 5 different women, one for each day of the week, always in 2-hour sessions? After this conversation, I became even more intrigued and concerned. Her answer had been very vague, very evasive. If this were a normal job, she wouldn't have had any trouble explaining it clearly, right? For the rest of that week, I intensified my observations. I began to notice other details that had previously gone unnoticed. For example, what kind of clothing each person wore when they arrived versus when they left. If they carried anything specific, what their facial expressions were like when they arrived and when they left. And that's when I started noticing some very strange things that didn't make sense with any of the theories I had come up with up until then. Monday's tall brunette, for example, sometimes arrived wearing one outfit and left wearing something completely different. One time she arrived in jeans and a casual blouse and left in an elegant dress and heels. Another time she arrived in sportswear and left in a formal outfit. How so? Tuesday's blonde always carried that big backpack, but sometimes she'd leave carrying things other than what she'd brought. Once I saw her leaving with what looked like folded clothes in her arms. Another time she was carrying something wrapped in a cloth that I couldn't quite make out. And Wednesday's redhead, who always arrived very serious and professional, sometimes left smiling and looking completely relaxed, as if she'd had a very pleasant experience. The transformation in her mood was palpable. One thing that really caught my attention was the noise. Some mornings, especially when it was quieter in the neighborhood, I could hear sounds coming from Carlos's house. They weren't the sounds I was imagining, girls. It was more like raised voices, as if they were arguing or acting something out. Sometimes it sounded like they were doing exercises or repetitive movements. And what's more, every now and then I'd hear music coming from there. Not romantic or sensual music, but dramatic soundtracks, like those played in movies or soap operas during suspenseful or emotional scenes. What kind of intimate encounter would require a dramatic soundtrack? It was on a Thursday that everything began to take a completely different turn. I was in the laundry room hanging out clothes when I heard Carlos's doorbell ring. I ran to the front window and saw it was the brunette with the bun, as always, on Thursdays. But this time, for some reason, she didn't come in right away. He stood at the door talking to Carlos for several minutes, and for the first time I could hear fragments of their conversation. And girls, what I heard left me even more confused. "The new text arrived yesterday," I heard her say, "but I confess I'm having trouble marking that scene in the second act." Carlos replied something about body position and facial expression. "You need to feel the emotion first," I heard him say, "then let it manifest itself through your whole body." Text, marking, second act, facial expression. Man, imagine the confusion in my head. My mind, of course, went straight to the most obvious place. I thought maybe they were talking about, well, you know, positions and expressions related to intimate activities. And this second act thing only confirmed my darkest suspicions. But at the same time, something still didn't add up in my theory. If it was what I was thinking, why would they talk about it so openly, on their doorstep, where any neighbor could hear? And why didn't Carlos seem the least bit concerned about being discreet about it? I continued listening to the conversation, and I heard the woman asking about costume, and Carlos answering something about characterization. Character? Costume? Characterization? These words started to sound familiar, but I couldn't quite place them. After she entered the house, I stood there in the laundry room, trying to process what I'd heard. There was something about that conversation that didn't fit my infidelity theory, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. That's when I decided I needed to find out the truth, once and for all. I couldn't live with that doubt hammering away at me 24 hours a day. Maria didn't deserve to be deceived like that, and if it really was what I suspected, I would have to find a delicate and careful way to let her know what was happening. So I came up with a plan. The following Friday, when it was the gray-haired lady's turn, I would find a way to find out once and for all what was really going on in there. Even if it meant invading their privacy a bit, I felt it was my moral duty to uncover the truth, and if necessary, protect Maria from a humiliating situation. I spent all of Thursday planning my investigation strategy. I considered several approaches, making up an excuse to knock on the door, observing the house from different angles, or even following one of the women as she left to try to learn more about them. On Thursday night, I could barely sleep from anxiety and anticipation. I felt so close to unraveling the mystery that had consumed my every thought for the past few weeks. And I had a strong hunch that this discovery could completely change everything I thought about this whole strange situation. And girls, what I discovered on Friday was just the beginning of a series of revelations that completely changed my perspective on what was happening at Carlos's house. But you'll have to wait for that part of the story, because I guarantee none of you will be able to guess the truth behind all this. From there, I knew they sometimes opened the windows to air out the house, and maybe I could see, or at least hear something, that would give me a definitive clue as to what was really going on inside. The lady arrived promptly at 9:30, as always, but this time I paid attention to every microscopic detail of her arrival. She wasn't carrying just a handbag, as I'd previously thought. She also carried a small suitcase with wheels, 2 well-filled craft paper bags, and a long, thin object carefully wrapped in dark fabric. What the hell was that? Carlos greeted her at the door as he always did with everyone else, but this time they chatted for much longer before entering. I strained my hearing to the max and managed to catch a few words of the conversation. "Today we're going to work on that most difficult scene. Did you manage to bring everything I asked for?" "Yes, everything is here." "Great. Then we can start prepping." Preparation. Difficult scene. Girls, my imagination was literally running wild. What kind of difficult scene was this? And what kind of preparation did they need to do? And most importantly, what mysterious object was that wrapped in the fabric she had so carefully brought? After they entered the house, I remained in my observation position for almost half an hour, trying to catch any sound or movement that might give me a clue. The house was completely silent for a while, and I was starting to consider giving up and going back to my normal activities when I heard something that literally made my blood run cold. It was a scream, a very loud female scream that sounded like genuine pain or deep despair. My heart raced and I began to tremble. Was Carlos doing something terrible to that poor woman? Was he some kind of psychopath who lured women to his house to hurt them in some way? I stood completely paralyzed for a few seconds, unsure whether to call the police immediately or run to the house to check on the woman. My mind was in a state of complete panic, imagining the most horrific scenarios possible. But then I heard Carlos's voice, in a tone that seemed to be giving instructions or guidance. "No, not like that, Donna Mercedes. You need to put more feeling, more truth into the pain. The emotion needs to come from within. Let's try one more time, but this time think about the character's real situation. Mrs. Mercedes, I finally knew your name. And more importantly, he was talking about character and feeling in pain. What did that mean?" And then the scream came again, but this time I paid attention differently. It sounded less natural, more theatrical, as if it were deliberate, rehearsed, studied. And soon after I heard applause. Yes, applause. And Donna Mercedes' voice asking, "Is that better, Professor Carlos?" Was I able to better convey the character's anguish? "Professor Carlos! Professor Girls!" It was like a bolt of lightning had struck me. It all started to sink in a way I had never imagined. No, it couldn't be what I was thinking. Completely dismiss that possibility. Carlos was always a very simple, very ordinary guy, with no apparent artistic sophistication. How could he be teaching anything related to art or acting? But then I started remembering some things Maria had mentioned to me over the years, details that hadn't caught my attention at the time. She'd mentioned that Carlos had an interesting professional background before they moved here. And a few months ago, when I asked why he was working from home more, she said something vague about him having some health issues that made it harder for him to commute. I remained in my observation position and managed to hear more fragments of their conversation. Donna Mercedes talked about memorizing the lines for the third act, and Carlos responded with things about stage movement, timing entrances, and interpreting emotional subtext. Stage, lines, timing, emotional subtext? Man, my head started buzzing with a completely revolutionary possibility, unlike anything I'd imagined until then. But it still didn't make complete sense. If it really was theater, why at home? Why so discreetly? And why exactly 5 different women, one for each day of the week? The session with Donna Mercedes lasted much longer than the others I had observed. It was almost 3.5 hours. And throughout that time, I kept hearing fragments of conversation that increasingly confirmed my new theory. I heard them talking about set design, costume design, lighting, stage direction, and character development. Why, these were technical terms I vaguely recognized from TV shows about theater and film, but which I never would have imagined hearing outside my neighbor Carlos's house. And even more interesting, at times I heard Donna Mercedes practicing dramatic lines, and Carlos correcting the intonation, suggesting changes in the interpretation, explaining what the character would be feeling at each moment of the story. When she finally emerged from the house, I immediately noticed she was completely transformed. She didn't look tired like the other women after their sessions. On the contrary, she was radiant, smiling broadly, and carrying a briefcase full of papers that appeared to be scripts or playbills. Before getting into the car, she even turned to Carlos, who had walked her to the door, and said loud enough for me to hear, "Thank you so much, Professor. This class was simply transformative. I can't wait to put it all into practice on stage." Stage! She had said stage, and she had called him teacher again. It was at that precise moment that I made a decision that would completely change the course of this investigation. I decided that the following Monday, when the tall brunette arrived for her session, I would find a way to definitively, and without a shadow of a doubt, find out what was going on there, even if it meant doing something I had never done before in my life, spying in a more direct and risky way. I spent the entire weekend in a state of anxiety and anticipation, meticulously planning how I would conduct this final investigation. I considered several possibilities: inventing an emergency to knock on the door, observing from a completely different angle, or even asking Maria directly about what her husband did during the day. But I knew that if I asked Maria and it really was some kind of infidelity, I'd be creating a huge problem and possibly destroying a marriage. On the other hand, if it really was what I was beginning to suspect, something theater-related, why would it be kept secret? On Sunday night, I literally couldn't sleep. I stayed up late, mentally reviewing all the details I'd observed over the past few weeks, trying to fit the puzzle pieces together in a way that made complete sense. Monday arrived and I positioned myself much earlier than usual at the observation window. I wanted to be fully prepared when the tall brunette appeared, and this time, I had a much bolder plan than all the others. The brunette arrived exactly on time as always, but this time I noticed details that had completely gone unnoticed in all my previous observations. Not only was she carrying that large brown leather bag, but she also carried a briefcase, similar to the one the redhead always carried, and what definitely looked like clothes, neatly folded in a clear plastic bag. When she entered Carlos's house, I made the bravest and riskiest decision of this entire investigation. I went out the back door of my yard and approached the hedge dividing our lots. From there, I could hear much better everything that was going on inside the house and maybe even see something through the gaps in the curtains. And girls, what I heard there was the beginning of the most surprising and unexpected revelation you can imagine. But for you to understand the full extent of this discovery, I need to tell you all the details of what I witnessed in those moments that changed everything. So there I was, hiding behind the fence like a real private detective, risking discovery at any moment, but determined to solve once and for all this mystery that had taken over my life. The first thing that caught my attention was Carlos's tone of voice. It definitely wasn't the tone of someone having a romantic encounter or any kind of suspicious activity. It was a professorial, didactic tone, as if he were teaching something complex and important to someone who was genuinely interested in learning. "Beatrice," I heard him say. "I finally learned the tall brunette's name. You need to understand that acting isn't just about memorizing the lines. You need to feel the emotion first, understand the character's motivations, and only then let that emotion manifest itself through your body, your voice, your movements." And Beatrice responded in a focused and respectful voice. "Yes, Professor Carlos, but sometimes I feel like I'm not able to access the emotion that the character should be feeling in that scene." "That's normal," he replied patiently. "Let's work on emotional memory exercises. Think of a situation in your own life where you felt something similar to what your character is experiencing. Use that memory as a bridge to find the emotional truth of the scene." Emotional memory, emotional truth, character. Girls, there was no longer any doubt. Carlos was teaching acting classes. But why at home? And why was this treated like a secret? I continued listening, completely fascinated by the discovery. I heard Carlos explaining breathing techniques for emotional control, talking about how to use the body to express different moods, teaching about rhythm and pauses in dramatic speech. "Now let's work on that scene from the first act," he said. "Remember, your character just discovered her husband was cheating on her. How do you think she would react physically to this discovery? So ironic, right, girls? I thought I was witnessing a real betrayal, and they were rehearsing a scene about fictional betrayal. For over an hour I stood there, listening to fragments of a complete acting class. I heard Beatrice practicing different intonations for the same phrase, experimenting with variations in body movement, working on the gradual buildup of emotional tension in a scene. And most impressively, Carlos demonstrated a deep and technical knowledge of dramatic art. He cited acting methods, spoke about great actors and directors, and explained complex theoretical concepts in a didactic and accessible way. "Now let's experiment with the costume," I heard him say. "How do you feel wearing these clothes? How do they affect your posture? How would the character move wearing these clothes?" Costumes? That's what was in those plastic bags I saw the women carrying. They were theater clothes, costumes for the characters they were studying. After Monday's session ended and Beatrice left, I stood there behind the fence, trying to process everything I'd learned. My mind was racing, reorganizing all the information I'd gathered over the past few weeks into this new perspective. The 5 different women weren't lovers. They were drama students. The fixed schedules weren't romantic encounters, they were scheduled classes. The bags and purses didn't carry suspicious objects, but study materials, texts, costumes, notes. But important questions remained. Why did Carlos teach at home? Why wasn't this public knowledge in the neighborhood? And most importantly, who was he really to have so much knowledge about theater? On Tuesday, when it was Sandra's turn, now I knew the short blonde's name too, I was observing with a completely different perspective. I was no longer spying out of suspicion, but out of genuine curiosity about the artistic work happening right next door. And it was on that day that I was able to observe the class from a better angle. I positioned myself at the second-story window of my house, from where I had a partial view of Carlos's classroom through a gap in the curtain. What I saw definitively confirmed everything I'd discovered the day before, but also brought some surprising new information. The room had been completely reorganized to function as a small theater rehearsal studio. The armchairs were pushed against the walls, creating a wide space in the center of the room. On the floor were colored tape marking different positions, just like I'd seen in theater documentaries. There was also a small, large mirror propped against the wall, the kind dancers use to observe their movements. And Carlos was there, not doing anything suspicious or inappropriate, but giving a professional lesson in theatrical interpretation. He demonstrated movements, explained techniques, jotted down observations in a notebook, and guided Sandra with the patience and knowledge of a true teacher. "Remember, Sandra," I could hear, "your character is a strong woman who is hiding her vulnerability. How can you show this duality through your body posture?" Sandra practiced different ways of walking, gesturing, and positioning her body. It was fascinating to watch her experiment with different approaches to the same character, always with Carlos's careful guidance. But it was when I saw Carlos get up from his chair that I began to understand why the classes were held at home. He stood up very carefully, as if in pain, and when he demonstrated some movement to the student, it was clear he had significant physical limitations. He limped slightly, moved very cautiously, and sometimes placed his hand on his back as if in discomfort. It was obvious he was experiencing health problems that hampered his mobility. This explained why the classes were held at home. If Carlos had back problems or some similar physical limitation, it would be much more practical and comfortable for him to receive students at home than to have to travel to a studio or drama school. During Sandra's class, I also noticed other interesting details that confirmed my new theory. She carried in her backpack theater texts, handwritten notes, and even some clothes that were clearly rehearsal costumes. The two worked on a very emotionally intense scene, where Sandra's character underwent a dramatic transformation throughout the dialogue. It was incredible to see how she discovered new layers of her character, with Carlos's guidance. And most impressively, when the class ended, Sandra seemed completely fulfilled and happy. She thanked Carlos profusely, saying she was finally understanding aspects of the character she hadn't grasped before. "Professor," she said, "you have a special gift for teaching. You can make people understand things that seemed impossible before." The way she treated him, with such respect and admiration, made it clear that Carlos wasn't just any teacher. He was someone recognized and skilled in the theater field. On Wednesday, it was Helena's turn, the curly-haired redhead. This time, I was watching with genuine admiration for the work being done there, rather than the suspicion that had consumed me for weeks. Helena's class was particularly interesting because it involved working with props. I saw that she brought several items in her briefcase: a scarf, an old book, a letter, and a few other small objects that she used to create the atmosphere of the scene she was rehearsing. Carlos explained to her how to use each object theatrically, how to make them become extensions of the character, and how to correctly time each item during dialogue. "An object on stage is never just decorative," I heard him explain. "Each item needs to tell part of the story, needs to reveal something about the character or the dramatic moment we're living in." It was a theater masterclass happening right next door to my house, and I had spent weeks thinking it was something completely different. But there was still one piece of the puzzle I couldn't fully understand. Why was all this kept secret? Why didn't Carlos talk openly about teaching acting? Why didn't the neighborhood know anything? The answer to this question only came on Thursday, during Anna's class, the brunette with the bun. And girls, when I found out the reason, everything became even more touching and inspiring. Don't leave the video now, because what I discovered will surprise you in ways you never imagined. The truth behind this whole story is far more beautiful and moving than any theory I could have come up with. I was in my usual observation position when I heard a conversation in the backyard of Carlos's house. The voices were coming from the laundry room, and one of them was definitely Maria's, who had arrived home from work early that day. She was talking on the phone, and from the tone of her voice, it sounded like she was talking to a healthcare professional, probably a doctor. "Dr. Roberto," she said, "I know you're worried about my husband's back, but I need you to understand something important. Since Carlos started teaching theater classes at home again, his depression has completely improved." Depression. Carlos was dealing not only with physical back problems, but also with depression. Now everything was starting to make perfect sense. "I know you think he should rest completely and focus solely on physical therapy," Maria continued. "But doctor, I spend time with him every day. I see how radiant he is when he's teaching. It's as if theater is the most important and effective medicine for his emotional state." My heart sank when I heard this. Imagine the situation. A man who clearly had a deep passion for theater, who possessed knowledge and talent for teaching, being forced to interrupt his career due to health problems, and consequently falling into depression. "Doctor," Maria continued, "before he spent the whole day lying on the couch with no energy for anything, saying he felt useless, that his career was over. Now he has a purpose again. There are people who depend on him, who value his knowledge." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, and I managed to capture other important fragments. The students respect him a lot. He's back to being the man I married. He prefers to keep it discreet so he doesn't have to explain the situation to everyone. Now I understood perfectly why everything was kept secret. Carlos was going through a delicate period in his health, and he probably didn't want his neighbors asking questions about his condition, offering advice on treatment, or worse, looking at him with pity. Keeping his classes secret was a way to preserve his dignity and privacy, while he recovered and found a new way to pursue his professional passion. After Maria hung up the phone, I stood there, feeling both thrilled by the discovery and ashamed that I had suspected such terrible things about a situation that was, in fact, beautiful and inspiring. Carlos wasn't betraying anyone. He was being faithful to what was most precious and important to him: his talent, his passion for theater, and his desire to share his knowledge with others. The 5 women weren't secret lovers. They were angels who, without fully knowing the situation, were helping a talented man find meaning in life again. On Friday, when it was Donna Mercedes's turn, the gray-haired lady, I was observing the situation with completely different eyes. I was no longer spying, but rather admiring a beautiful work of art that was happening right next to me. And it was on that day that I witnessed the most moving and touching scene in this entire saga. Donna Mercedes arrived with even more materials than usual. In addition to the usual bags, she carried a larger suitcase and what appeared to be a carefully packaged period dress. I overheard that they were going to work on a very special scene, something she described as the most challenging monologue of my life. And from what I could gather, it was a scene where she played a mother reuniting with her son after many years of separation. The preparation was long and meticulous. I listened as Carlos helped her get into character, explaining details about period costumes, advising on theatrical makeup, and discussing the character's psychology. "Mercedes," I heard him say fondly, "remember that your character has carried this pain for decades. When she finally finds her son, it's like all those pent-up emotions explode at once." When she finally began to perform the scene, I confess I was deeply moved, even watching from afar. The emotional intensity of her performance was impressive. She managed to convey decades of longing, love, pain, and joy in just a few minutes of performance. And when it was over, I heard Carlos stand, albeit with difficulty, and applaud enthusiastically. "Mercedes," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "at 70, you still managed to give me goosebumps with your performance. It's because of students like you that I continue to teach, even with all the physical limitations I face." 70 years old! Donna Mercedes was 70 years old and was still studying theater, pursuing her artistic dreams, challenging herself to grow as a performer. It was the most inspiring and beautiful thing I had ever witnessed in my life. At that moment, I finally understood the true dimension of what was happening in Carlos's house. He wasn't just a man teaching acting classes to supplement his income. He was an experienced and talented artist, temporarily limited by health issues, but who had found a creative and touching way to continue sharing his passion and knowledge with people who truly loved the arts. And these 5 women weren't just paying students. They were courageous individuals, each with their own story and motivation, united by a shared passion for theater and the extraordinary good fortune of having found a master willing to teach even while facing their own difficulties and limitations. But girls, the story isn't over yet, because after discovering all this, I still needed to better understand who Carlos really was and why these 5 women treated him with such reverence and respect. And that's when I began a completely different investigation. Instead of spying, I decided to investigate. I remembered that Maria had mentioned several times over the years that Carlos had an interesting professional background before they moved to our neighborhood. So I started searching online for information about theater directors and teachers in our area. And girls, you won't believe what I discovered. It wasn't easy finding the information because I only knew his first name, but after a lot of searching, I finally found references to Carlos Eduardo Mendonça. That was my neighbor's full name. Carlos Eduardo Mendonça wasn't just any community theater director. He had been one of the most important and respected names in professional theater in our region for over 25 years. He had directed dozens of famous plays, worked with actors who later became nationally known, and even won several important cultural awards. I found old newspaper articles, always with photos of him alongside famous actors, at awards ceremonies, at premieres of important plays. I saw interviews where other theater professionals spoke of him as a master, a visionary, someone who revolutionized directing in the region. I discovered that the theater school he ran was considered one of the best in the entire state. Taking classes with Carlos Eduardo Mendonça was a privilege few could achieve, because he was very selective and only accepted students who demonstrated genuine dedication and talent for the performing arts. I even found a newspaper article from 3 years ago talking about how he had to temporarily suspend his activities due to serious back problems resulting from decades of intense work in the theater. The article mentioned that the entire artistic community in the region was rooting for his recovery. Now I completely understood why those 5 women treated him with such reverence and admiration. They weren't just students of some random professor. They had the extraordinary fortune of studying with a living legend of regional theater, even though he was going through a difficult period of health. I was so impressed and moved by this discovery that I almost did the crazy thing of knocking on his door to introduce myself as a newfound admirer. But then I remembered all the times I'd greeted him in a completely ordinary way on the street, treating him like a regular neighbor without having the slightest idea who he really was. Imagine the situation. Me, an ordinary neighbor, casually greeting on the street a man who was a celebrity in the theater world, who had dedicated decades of his life to art, who had trained generations of actors and directors. The following week, I began observing the classes with completely different eyes. I was no longer eavesdropping out of morbid curiosity or unfounded suspicion, but rather observing, always respectfully and discreetly, the work of a genuinely talented artist who, despite facing significant physical limitations, continued to dedicate his life to the art he loved. And it was on a Tuesday, during Sandra's class, that I witnessed something especially touching and meaningful. Sandra arrived that day feeling particularly nervous and anxious. I could hear her telling Carlos that she had secured an important audition for a role in a professional play, but she was completely unsure of her ability and preparation. Carlos dedicated the entire class that day to working specifically with her insecurity and nervousness. He spent over 2 hours teaching her techniques to manage anxiety, demonstrating breathing and concentration exercises, helping her find the confidence she needed to face the test. "Sandra," I heard him say in a firm but extremely caring voice, "you have enough natural talent to get any role you truly desire. What you need now is to learn to believe in yourself. Theater is not just about perfect technique. It is above all about emotional truth. And you have so much truth and authenticity within you. Girls, I confess I was deeply moved right there, hidden in my observation position, seeing that man facing his own difficulties and physical limitations, dedicating so much time, energy, and care to helping someone achieve a professional dream was one of the most beautiful and inspiring things I had ever witnessed. It was like attending an art therapy session, where the teacher was not just teaching acting techniques, but helping a person find inner strength and self-confidence. And you know what was most exciting? A week later, Sandra arrived for class completely radiant and happy. I had gotten the part in the play, and the first thing she did was thank Carlos profusely, saying that without the confidence and preparation he had given her, she would never have gotten the opportunity. "Professor," she said with tears in her eyes, "you didn't just teach me theater. You taught me to believe that I can achieve my dreams." It was on that day that I finally understood that I wasn't just observing conventional acting classes. I was witnessing an extraordinary man transforming lives through art, even as he faced his own personal battles with health issues and physical limitations. I then began to pay closer attention to each of the 5 women and discovered that they all had fascinating personal stories that explained why they sought out Carlos's classes. Beatrice, the tall brunette from Monday, always arrived tense and stressed, but left class completely relaxed and smiling. I learned through snippets of conversation that she was an executive working in a very stressful company, and theater served as a kind of therapy and creative outlet for her. Helena, Wednesday's redhead, was a literature teacher at a public school and wanted to incorporate theater techniques into her classes to make them more dynamic and engaging for teenagers. Classes with Carlos were completely transforming her teaching style. Anna, Thursday's brunette, was a clinical psychologist studying theater to use drama and acting techniques in her therapies. She believed theater could help her patients express difficult emotions and work through trauma more effectively. And Donna Mercedes, the 70-year-old woman, was simply fulfilling a childhood dream she'd never had the opportunity to pursue. She'd always loved theater, but never had the means or courage to study. Now, in her senior years, she was finally allowing herself to explore this passion. Each of them had a beautiful story, a deep motivation, a personal dream, and Carlos was the generous facilitator, the dedicated mentor who helped them all achieve their goals through theater. But the most moving and revealing moment of this entire saga was yet to come. It happened on a Friday about 6 weeks into my observations, when I witnessed something that forever changed the way I viewed not only this situation, but life as a whole. It was a rainy day, and I was in the kitchen making breakfast when I heard unusual activity in Carlos's backyard. It wasn't his usual voices with a student, but several female voices chatting animatedly at the same time. I looked out the window and saw something surprising. All 5 women were arriving together. Beatriz, Sandra, Helena, Anna, and Donna Mercedes, all at the same time carrying bags, flowers, and what looked like a small pie. It was clear they had something special planned, some kind of surprise or tribute for Carlos. And when he opened the door and saw all the students there together, the look of surprise and emotion on his face was indescribable. "Professor," I heard Donna Mercedes speaking on behalf of the group, "we have organized ourselves to give a short presentation for you. We want to show our gratitude for everything you have done for each of us." They entered the house, and for the next hour I heard fragments of what was clearly a theatrical performance. Voices reciting dramatic texts, applause, laughter, and several times Carlos's emotional voice commenting on the performances. When the presentation ended, I heard him speaking to the group. "Girls, you have no idea how much this means to me. You've given me back the meaning of my professional life. You've shown me that even with physical limitations, I can still contribute to the art I love." And then I heard Sandra's voice. "Professor, we are the ones who should thank you. You didn't just teach us theater. You taught us courage, self-confidence, perseverance. Each of us became a better person after we started studying with you. Girls, let me know what you thought of this story in the comments. Did you see how it would end? And subscribe to the channel, because when you subscribe, you'll be notified whenever I post new videos with more neighborhood stories." That special encounter between the 5 students and Carlos was the moment I finally grasped the full and true dimension of what I had been observing for all those weeks. He wasn't just a teacher giving classes to supplement his income or occupy his time. He was a genuine artist facing personal adversity who had created a small magical universe where dreams were nurtured and people were transformed through art. In the following weeks, I learned that the students' performance had been such a success that other people in the neighborhood were interested in taking classes with the famous Carlos Eduardo Mendonça. Maria proudly told me that he already had a small waiting list of people wanting to study theater with the master who lives in our neighborhood. I signed up for this waiting list myself. After all, I've discovered that it's never too late to learn something new, especially when you have the extraordinary opportunity to learn from someone as talented, dedicated, and inspiring as Carlos. Maria also revealed to me that his health has improved significantly since returning to teaching. His passion for theater and the joy of seeing his students thrive have been the best possible remedy for his depression. Although he still has physical limitations in his spine, he's found a perfect way to continue doing what he loves most in life. Ruth, she told me one day. My husband is back to being the happy, fulfilled, and inspired man I married so many years ago. These 5 women have been angels in his life, even without fully knowing the situation. Today, whenever I see Carlos watering his plants in the backyard, I greet him with much more affection, respect, and admiration. And when I see the 5 women arriving for classes, or the new students who have joined the group, I smile, knowing I'm witnessing special encounters where dreams come true, talents develop, and lives are transformed through art. This whole story taught me fundamental lessons that I will carry with me forever. First, we should never judge a situation or person without knowing all the facts and context. Second, behind behaviors that seem strange or suspicious to us, there may be beautiful stories of resilience, art, and generosity. Third, our neighbors can be absolutely extraordinary people we simply don't know well. And finally, art, whether theater, music, painting, or any other form of expression, has incredible transformative power. It can cure depression, build self-confidence, fulfill dreams, and connect people in deep and meaningful ways. If you enjoyed this unexpected twist, please like the video and leave a comment. Have you ever been in a situation where you realized you'd completely misjudged someone? I love reading your stories. And don't forget, by subscribing to the channel, you'll receive notifications whenever I post new stories from the neighborhood. You can be sure there's always something interesting and surprising happening around here. And I continue to observe everything from my privileged little window. I'm already preparing the next story for you, which is about the neighbor on the right, who receives very mysterious letters every Tuesday, always at the same time. But that's an adventure for the next video. That's it for today, girls. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the end of this surprising and moving story. I hope you enjoyed it and were as moved as I enjoyed telling it to you. Until the next neighborhood gossip. And remember, sometimes the best stories are the ones that teach us to see the world and people with more generosity and less